On February 4th, 2026, something ended. There were no explosions, no air raid sirens, no flashing red banners breaking into your screen. But for the first time in decades, the United States and Russia, the two largest nuclear powers on Earth, are no longer bound by any limits on their strategic nuclear arsenals. The last remaining nuclear arms control treaty between them is gone. For years, that agreement placed hard caps on deployed warheads, missiles, and launchers. It imposed structure, predictability, and a degree of restraint between two nations capable of destroying the planet. Now, that structure has expired, and the question is no longer whether the world feels stable. The question is whether we are stepping into a new era, one defined not by negotiated ceilings, but by open-ended expansion. Are we entering a new nuclear arms race? I'm Livia, and this is Global Shift Analysis, where we decode the power shifts reshaping the global order. Tonight, we examine the expiration of the New START Treaty, the warnings from former U.S. officials, Russia's reaction, America's strategic debate, and the growing influence of China. Because what happens next may shape global security for decades to come. The agreement at the center of this moment was known as New START, the New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, and it entered into force in February 2011. It was considered a landmark accord between Washington and Moscow, negotiated at a time when both sides still believed that structured nuclear restraint served their mutual interests. Unlike broad political declarations, New START was built on specific, measurable ceilings. Each country was capped at 1,150 deployed nuclear warheads. They were limited to 700 deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers equipped to carry nuclear weapons. In total, they could maintain no more than 800 deployed and non-deployed launchers. For more than a decade, these numbers defined the upper boundary of the world's two largest nuclear arsenals. The treaty placed hard limits on Russian intercontinental systems capable of reaching the United States, while also constraining American strategic forces in return. It was not disarmament, but it was discipline. Originally signed for 10 years, the treaty was set to expire in 2021. That year, both governments agreed to extend it for an additional 5 years, pushing its final deadline to February 4th, 2026. This time, however, there was no legal pathway for another extension. Washington and Moscow could have chosen to continue observing the caps voluntarily. They did not. And now, for the first time since the modern era of U.S.-Russian arms control began at the height of the Cold War, both nuclear superpowers are operating without binding limits on their strategic arsenals. Thomas Countryman, former acting Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, outlined what he considers the worst-case scenario. In his words, the worst case is it spirals, and then some unforeseen or foreseeable incident touches off a conflict that escalates rapidly to a nuclear conflict. Without agreed limits, three major dangers begin to surface. First is the possibility of uploading warheads. Both the United States and Russia maintain missiles capable of carrying more nuclear warheads than they were allowed under New START. The treaty required each side to limit how many were actually deployed. With those caps gone, either country could increase the number of warheads mounted on existing missiles relatively quickly, expanding destructive capacity without building entirely new delivery systems. Second is the loss of transparency. New START was not just about numbers. It included data exchanges, notifications, and verification measures that allowed each side to monitor the other's strategic forces. That predictability reduced uncertainty. Without it, assumptions replace facts. Paul Dean, former Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Deterrence, and Stability, put it plainly: we do not benefit from a wasteful, inefficient arms race. We do not benefit from a lack of predictability and transparency. We don't benefit from potential miscommunication or miscalculation. Third is escalation risk driven by imbalance. Rose Gottemuller, who served as chief U.S. negotiator for New START, warned that Russia could move rapidly to upload additional warheads. Moscow maintains active warhead production lines, active production for missile components, and available industrial capacity to scale quickly. The United States, by contrast, would need time to reverse compliance modifications made to submarines and bombers in order to meet treaty limits. Her concern is a scenario in which Russia accelerates ahead while Washington is still preparing, potentially leaving the United States in the dust. Such asymmetry could strain deterrence and inject instability into an already tense strategic environment. President Donald Trump has shown little concern about the treaty's expiration. If it expires, it expires. We'll do a better agreement, he told the New York Times, signaling a willingness to move beyond the framework of New START without immediate hesitation. Secretary of State Marco Rubio further clarified the administration's position, indicating that the United States would likely not continue to observe the treaty's limits on its own. The reasoning behind this shift is centered on China. Rubio explained, "In order to have true arms control in the 21st century, it's impossible to do something that doesn't include China because of their vast and rapidly growing stockpile. This marks a significant strategic recalibration. When New START was negotiated more than a decade ago, China's nuclear arsenal was comparatively small, and its potential threat was often treated as secondary. Today, the landscape is markedly different. According to a 2022 Pentagon report, China could amass as many as 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035 if it continues its current trajectory." Throughout his first term, Trump pursued the idea of a trilateral nuclear agreement involving the United States, Russia, and China. However, Beijing has consistently refused to engage in formal negotiations that would place limits on its arsenal. While multiple Track 2 discussions on strategic stability have taken place between U.S. and Chinese experts over the past year, these talks have largely focused on general dialogue rather than concrete limitations. China's position is clear. It still considers its nuclear force below the combined capabilities of the U.S. and Russia and sees no strategic benefit in freezing its growth. The result is a complex standoff. The United States seeks broader multilateral arms control. Russia is poised to act independently, and China maintains its refusal to be constrained, leaving the global nuclear order in uncharted territory. Because what happens next may shape global security for decades to come. I'm Livia. Thank you for watching Global Shift Analysis, decoding the power shifts reshaping our world. Russia's response to the expiration of New START has been firm and unambiguous. The Foreign Ministry confirmed that they received no formal reply from Washington regarding President Vladimir Putin's proposal last September to extend the treaty's limits for another year. At the time, Trump had commented that the idea sounds like a good idea, but no official agreement ever materialized. Moscow described the U.S. approach as erroneous and regrettable, signaling frustration with what it perceives as deliberate inaction. In its public statement, Russia made clear that it now considers both sides no longer bound by any obligations or symmetrical declarations, and are in principle free to choose their next steps. This declaration carries weight. It signals that Russia views the treaty's framework as fully dissolved, removing any formal expectation of restraint. What was once a carefully negotiated system of caps, transparency measures, and verification protocols is now effectively null. For Moscow, any decision to limit its arsenal or exercise caution is no longer mandated. It would be voluntary. And without reciprocal commitments from Washington, unilateral restraint becomes strategically optional. This shift marks a decisive moment. The rules that shaped U.S.-Russian nuclear interaction for more than a decade have disappeared, leaving the door open to rapid expansion, strategic recalculation, and heightened uncertainty in global security. Experts are deeply divided over how the United States should respond to the expiration of New START, with two sharply contrasting schools of thought emerging. On one side is the camp advocating restraint. Rose Gottemuller, who served as chief U.S. negotiator for New START, argues that a short extension of the treaty, even just a year, would be strategically beneficial. "It gives us a chance to prepare right for what we need to do against the Chinese," she explained, emphasizing that America is not immediately ready to rush into anything. The idea is to maintain stability, preserve transparency, and buy time to plan carefully. Paul Dean, a former Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, concurs, noting that structured arms control prevents waste, reduces miscalculation, and limits the risk of unintended escalation. Daryl Kimball, Executive Director of the Arms Control Association, warns that without some measure of restraint, the world could see a dangerous three-way arms race among the U.S., Russia, and China. On the other side is the camp pushing for expansion. Matthew Kroenig of the Atlantic Council argues that the primary purpose of U.S. nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear war, not to uphold treaties. He points to the findings of the October 2023 Bipartisan Strategic Posture Commission, which emphasized that the size and composition of the nuclear force must account for the possibility of combined aggression from Russia and China. The Commission concluded that U.S. strategy should no longer treat China's nuclear forces as a lesser-included threat. Biden administration officials reportedly prepared the infrastructure for uploading additional warheads, a capability that remains ready to be executed, though it has not been activated. In other words, the United States has the option to expand its arsenal immediately if the political decision is made. The choice now rests squarely with President Trump: to maintain restraint and seek stability, or to embrace expansion and confront the emerging challenge from both Russia and China. The path he chooses could shape global nuclear dynamics for decades. Heather Williams of CSIS warns that a failure to demonstrate clear nuclear resolve could shake the confidence of U.S. allies around the world. When partners begin to doubt whether American security guarantees are credible, they may feel compelled to develop their own nuclear capabilities. History shows that this is exactly how arms races spread. One nation's caution becomes another nation's motivation to arm itself. Daryl Kimball of the Arms Control Association paints an even grimmer picture. In what he calls the Trump administration's wrecking ball approach to international treaties, the expiration of New START could set the stage for an unbridled, unconstrained arms race that is costly for all countries. Imagine three nuclear superpowers, the United States, Russia, and China, simultaneously expanding their arsenals without verification, without transparency, and without any agreed ceiling. For the first time in generations, the global order of nuclear restraint could vanish entirely. The careful frameworks and inspection regimes that once defined U.S.-Russian strategic relations would be gone, leaving the world in a state of heightened uncertainty. The era of predictable, measured nuclear competition that survived the Cold War would officially be over, replaced by a more dangerous landscape where miscalculation, rapid escalation, or industrial advantage could tip the balance in unforeseen ways. Every decision, every calculation, and every production line could have consequences that ripple far beyond borders. For decades, nuclear stability relied on clearly defined limits, inspections, and predictable behavior between the world's most powerful nations. That framework is now gone. The United States seeks to bring China to the negotiating table. China refuses. Russia stands ready to act swiftly, with the capacity to expand its arsenal at a moment's notice. The world is now at a strategic crossroads. One path offers temporary restraint, careful negotiation, and the chance to adapt responsibly to a changing nuclear landscape. The other path leads to unrestrained expansion, a potential three-way nuclear arms race between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing, and a return to a level of risk not seen since the height of the Cold War. As Thomas Countryman warned, escalation does not always begin with intention. Often it starts with a spiral, a series of actions and reactions that quickly escape control. I'm Livia. Here at Global Shift Analysis, we don't just report events. We break down the shifts that are redefining global power. If you want clear, in-depth analysis of the forces shaping the world, subscribe now. The next global shift may already be underway, and understanding it is not optional. It's essential.